And welcome back to ConTinual. This is Jim Nettles. I'll be your moderator and host tonight. Today we have a special publisher takeover with Crone Girls Press, and we're going to be talking about an anthology, Stories We Tell After Midnight, Part 2. And so with me today we have Rachel Brune, who is the founder for Crone Girls Press. But before we get started, let's go around the room and have everybody introduce themselves. Rachel, since I started with you, I'll let you go first.
Absolutely. So like Jim said, I'm the founder and currently editor at Crone Girls Press. The Stories We Tell After Midnight Volume 2 is our third full-length anthology, which will be out October 1st. And these Stories We Tell After Midnight, these are our collections, our anthologies of very traditional straight horror, hitting all of the traditional horror tropes, and of course, releasing in October because it is the month for that sort of thing.
Jude.
Headphones. So hello, I'm Judith Reid. I'm the token Scotswoman on the panel tonight. I'm a writer of mostly short fiction, mostly horror, and a bit of audio drama as my major interests. And delighted to have a story in the anthology. My story is called Iron Teeth, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Mike.
Hi, my name is Mike Sullivan. I'm from Massachusetts. I'm a new fiction writer, and I'm very excited because this is my first official publication experience. And my story is called The Bugs Come Out at Night, and I can't wait for people to be able to read it.
Priya.
Hi, I'm Priya Schreither. I'm a speculative fiction writer with both short and long works. My story in the anthology is called The Terrible Teddies, which is about a zombie run on Halloween, but with bears instead of zombies. It's a pleasure to be here.
Samantha.
Hi, I'm Samantha Bryant. I'm best known for my Menopausal Superheroes series of novels, but I am also addicted to writing for anthologies for the opportunity to experiment in a lot of different forms in short form that I don't have to commit a year of my life to complete. My story in this anthology is called The Cleaning Lady, which may not sound like horror, but I assure you it is.
And Eddie.
I'm Eddie Generous, and I run Unnerving and Unnerving magazine. I write long form and short form. I have, I think, 10 books with small presses out now. My story in this anthology is called Whisper Woods, and I guess thanks for having me.
Well, thanks everybody for coming and joining us today. So Rachel, why don't we talk a little bit about the history of the press and the anthology, talk a little bit about it, and then talk about how you roped everybody in to come join.
I put a call out. I'll answer the last part of your question first. I put a call out and found that there is a huge community of horror writers looking for a place to place their fiction. For our anthologies this year, which there were 2 full-length anthologies, one was Stories We Tell, which is the straight horror. The other one was the spring anthology, Coppice and Break, which was, there were some stories in there that were more in like the genre boundaries of horror. And for those 2 stories, which had about 48 slots, I received 1,600 submissions. And I'm rounding because that was a lot of submissions. And what I learned from that experience is that there are so many really excellent writers out there. It really came down to, did this person's story jump out at me? Did I find a connection to the story? And could I see myself promoting this story, not only when it launches, but for a long-term period? And that got me down to about 300 stories. And then I only had 48 slots, and I had to start looking for stories that went well together. And for this anthology, Stories We Tell After Midnight, it got a little bit easier because there were fewer stories that did speak to that straight horror vibe. One of the reasons why I started Crone Girls is because I really love short horror fiction. From, Ray Bradbury, H.P. Lovecraft, Stephen King, collections of anthologies, the year's best horror. I will read those constantly because I just love it. And so when I was going through these stories, I was thinking to myself, how do I get a collection, an anthology that will fit, on a bookshelf with these other anthologies? And so one of the things was, did they hit those traditional horror tropes? So Eddie, actually, you had sent me 2 stories, I think. The Winnebago.
Yeah.
Story. Yep. And the Whisperwood story. Both of them, I was sitting there thinking to myself, how do I pick between these 2? Luckily, another publisher, I think, made that decision for me because they picked up the other story. I was like, oh, I better send them an acceptance real quick.
Yeah.
Mike's story, oh my goodness. So I was looking for a novella to anchor the anthology. And Mike's story there's a personal connection of entomophobia. Like, bugs are the thing that make me squick. And so reading it, I was like, this is a terrible story, and I hate reading it, but I really love it, so I'm gonna accept it. And I had similar experiences. Priya, your story, I'm actually at this point in 2020, I'm ready to run into the woods with some bears. And then Jude's and Samantha's, again, these are all stories that just, like I said, they jumped out of the submissions queue, and I thought to myself, I have to have those. And that's how this anthology came to be.
Well, and I think that's what we see a lot of the time with anthologies is, and I mean, I know you guys as writers hit that point of, I'm putting a lot of stuff out. Where does it go? How does it get there? And I mean, I think that's the other side of looking at, if you're a publisher and working with a lot of publishers, it becomes, how do you pick what goes in? So why don't we start talking a little bit about the stories, and if you want to work in a little bit of maybe the inspiration on it. Rachel, I know why don't we kind of start? I know you've got some questions where you wanted to go.
That was actually my first question was, if everyone could maybe tell us a little bit about the story and the story behind the story.
Who wants to go first?
I could talk about mine.
All right.
So in October, I have this friend online named Bliss Morgan. And despite her name being Bliss, she's kind of a creepy lady. It's why I like her. And in every October, she does this challenge called Nightmare Fuel, where basically every day she posts a strange picture, maybe eerie, maybe outright horror, maybe just a little weird. And she challenges the community to create something for it. And I've participated for a few years. October tends to be a time of year that I'm feeling kind of burnt out on whatever my major project is, and running away to play in flash fiction for a month is fabulous. So she put out a picture that was this sink filled with gross gore and blood smeared across a mirror, and like arcane symbols drawn in the blood on the wall. And I looked at it and I thought, what a freaking mess. And so then the cleaning lady came in and she told me about what had happened and what she was cleaning up from. And that became the story that Rachel accepted for this anthology.
I can go next.
All right.
I live in Massachusetts, and every summer I go down to Cape Cod for a week around July 4th. And this was probably three or four summers ago. I was sitting in the back of this house we had rented with my family, and the funny part of the story is this scene that inspired the story never ends up in the story. But I was just looking up at the house, sitting in the backyard. We just come back from the beach, and for some reason I looked up at the house and I said, wouldn't it be weird if a giant grasshopper or a bug, like from those 1950s movies, just came from the other side of the house and looked down at me? And I couldn't get that image out of my head. So the rest of the week I was concocted a story where that might happen. And I took that house and I changed the location from Cape Cod to the mountains of Vermont, because I needed them to be away from phones and cell phone towers and stuff, because I needed this family to be isolated. And through the writing of the story and coming up with a reason for these bugs, the giant bugs kind of went away, but the core of the story remained, where this family goes up to Vermont to get away from it all. They're having some family issues. It's mom, dad, and 2 daughters, and they just find a note from the house they're renting that says, "Dear renters, have fun. There's no dishwasher. You got to wash your own dishes, and try to be inside before the sun goes down because the bugs come out at night." And the story goes from there. So the inspiration was just sitting in the backyard of this house I was renting on Cape Cod, and then the story just came eventually.
Can I just say, Mike, that if I rented a house and that note was inside, I would have just left. I don't care about my deposit. I would have just gone.
Yeah, well, you would have been the smart one.
Priya.
Okay, so the inspiration for my story actually came from a Goosebumps story I could not find for the love of me. As a kid, Goosebumps was one of the stories that got me into horror before I discovered Neil Gaiman, who's obviously better at kids horror. And the short stories are much harder to find than the books. You can only find copies online on the Internet Archive unless you're willing to pay $25 for a secondhand copy on Amazon. And so this story was called Please Don't Feed the Bears, which I only heard of in a Wikipedia entry, about a family that goes to a Cuddle Bear theme park with the older sister getting lost and nearly getting turned into a cuddle bear. And even though a lot of reviewers said the story was terrible, Blogger Beware refused to cover it. They just put up a Simpsons screen cap and said, if a story is called Please Don't Feed the Bears, you probably shouldn't read it. But it was sticking with me, and I was very fascinated, and I was wondering, how do you rework it? And how do you fix the stuff that's problematic in Stein stuff, which usually the younger siblings are annoying? It makes no sense, this theme park of bears and all that. Plus our local community center, Pinecrest, does a zombie run every year, apparently. And I came into the library one day and saw a bunch of kids in zombie makeup. So the ideas combined, and it became a story about a teddy run, only the bears aren't exactly cute and cuddly teddlies. And the run isn't exactly just for a bunch of nerds, as it starts in the story.
Eddie?
I've been trying to think of exactly where the inspiration of Whisperwoods came from. I think, though, because it was written around the same time as the other story I sent Rachel, I kind of go through stints where I'll write 4 or 5 shorts in a couple weeks. I think this one would have been inspired by something in the Creepshow reboot, because the other story was definitely inspired by something from that. So as far as I can tell, I just kind of, in my head, I did the right way, and I just picked the edge of the woods on the town where I grew up. And then the rest of it, I don't know, I really like when things enter bodies where they shouldn't be entering bodies. Like they make a new hole, for instance. I like when that happens. So that's kind of where that came about, I guess. I think there might be something else, but I don't remember.
Jude.
Well, there's a theory, I think, that all stories are fairy stories in some way. And that was where I started with Iron Teeth, because it is very much a fairy story. It's a little girl and her sister, and they get lost in the woods. Although, of course, on this occasion, the woods are Leningrad under siege. And the other thing that I wanted to explore in the story was the idea of monsters. And while a lot of my horror has inhuman monsters or legendary monsters in it, I really specifically wanted to explore what makes people into monsters. And it was the ideal setting for that. And of course, hunger and desperation and fear and what we do to survive are key to all of these fairy stories as well. And it just all fused into one fairly horrible whole, where lots of really dreadful things happen to people who really don't deserve it, which again tends to make for quite good horror.
Can I just say that Jude's accent is awesome? I could just listen to her talk about anything.
You're very kind.
So that actually, this leads into my next question or topic of discussion, because we launched Coppice and Break right as the pandemic hit, and as everything was shutting down, and some people for the first time were facing the fact that they couldn't go to the store and buy the thing that they wanted. And that simple thing seemed to have had quite an effect on certain people. You know, it's like, I can't go to the store and I can't buy this. Well, I guess I'll just turn into a monster. And, you know, we've all kind of seen those videos. As a horror publisher, I was like, okay, what do I do now? The answer was continue to publish, because I'd already contracted all the stories. But I have started to realize that there's a certain segment of the horror community, both the fans and the writers, who are flourishing in a pandemic. And so I kind of want to throw this topic of discussion out there. As a writer, you know, how do we continue to write when the news seems to be competing with us for story ideas? And as a fan, how are we consuming horror? You know, how do we, I guess the overall question that I'm trying to ask is, how are we integrating horror into both our professional lives and into the parts of ourselves that read horror for fun? Very specific question.
So my day job is teaching middle school. So I would argue that this makes me kind of an expert on horror, because it's a period of life that is at least psychologically horrible for most people, at least at some segment of it. And I know that as a lifetime reader of horror, you know, like Priya, I read things like Goosebumps when I was a kid, and watched Twilight Zone reruns with my mother and that kind of thing. So I started early, and I've always been attracted to horror in a mundane setting. Like, it's one thing if everybody went to the known haunted house to deal with the known horror in there. It's another thing when you are sitting at your kitchen table trying to drink your tea and something happens. And so I think that's kind of how the pandemic felt to me, is like, this is horror that just came out of regular life. You know, I was going around doing my thing, and then all of a sudden there's all this weird stuff going on. I have a series of short stories I'm hoping to put out as a collection myself sometime that I call the Shadow Hill stories. They're all set in a suburban neighborhood, suspiciously like the one I live in, except for all the weird things people do all have kind of a horror reason. You know, like the guy who's constantly trimming the grass is because if he doesn't, the grass will eat him, you know, and that kind of thing. And the weird people on the corner with the collie, there's something different about that collie. So that's kind of how it plays for me. And so it kind of feeds into the way my imagination works. So I'm one of the writers who's actually been able to write during this. I know that some of my writer friends have struggled a lot, that there's just too much going on out here to deal with, to be able to get lost in here like they need to. But I'm very good at ignoring all that to escape into something that I can do something with. So it's worked for me.
All right, Jude, you're up next.
Well, so when it comes to day jobs, I'm a surgeon in my day job, and I work for the NHS in Scotland. So I've had a very up close look at the pandemic. And one of my memories from it very early on was when we were seeing the reports coming out of the north of Italy, and just seeing the hospitals swamped with cases and going into work. So that was very interesting. It was almost stepping into the fiction and having that helplessness, that idea of the horror unfolding around you. It was a very nice, very visceral sort of experience to draw on later, although not very pleasant at the time. The other thing that I think has been fascinating about this, both as a reader and a writer, it's setting stuff and reading stuff set in the present day now comes with an additional challenge. Do you write about the pandemic? Because it's everything about your life. And I'm not quite ready, I think, to have that as the normal setting from which the character sets off into the unknown. But I suspect that's going to come the longer this goes on, because 2020 is now firmly anchored in history as the year of the pandemic.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's probably going to be a lot of horror and science fiction type stories in movies and novels coming out where there's going to be, metaphorically speaking, of the pandemic, kind of like in the 50s, how all those monster movies came out of the fear of nuclear war and nuclear, blasts and whatnot. And personally, I think I've been finding it quite a bit difficult to set my mind to sit down and write, just because of what's going on in the pandemic and the world around me. But I find that once I'm able to get myself past that, it is an escape, whether it's reading or writing. And I think a lot of us need this escape a lot more these days than maybe, less than a year ago. And it's odd to think that people want to escape into something horrific from stuff that's going on that's horrific, but we're all different and stuff. But those escapes are very important for us to mentally deal with what's going on in the world. And it's going to be interesting to see, 6, 8, 9, couple of years down the line, there's probably going to be a whole group of stories that'll have the pandemic either, between the lines or right there on top. And there's no way to avoid that.
Yeah, I can say I do wish the pandemic wasn't going on, and I haven't been talking about it in my writing unless it's nonfiction. On Medium, I wrote an article that became popular because I said this is basically the Jaws movie, only in this case, instead of a shark, we have a bunch of particles floating in the air that have no brain, or just a bunch of code that enter your body and convert your cells into little clones one by one. The episode Cells at Work has been oddly therapeutic for this, the anime. It's more of a comedy and an education fest because it shows every cell in the human body as an anthropomorphized human being, fighting anime monster germs, viruses, all that, even cute pollen allergens that are just large and unwieldy, but not evil. So I would say I have been missing going to my in-person writers group, seeing everyone. And right now I'm liaison for the Nano group officially, so we can't meet in person this year. It's definitely been harder, and I probably don't mention it at all in my fiction. In terms of horror, I think I prefer the written horror to cinematic, unless it's a bad horror movie watching with friends on Discord, because then you're just sort of watching and you're kind of like, man, these effects are fun. Eddie can tell you that the writing and rewriting has been a little slower because he accepted a novella from me last year called Offstage Offerings, and I was revising it for a couple of months, and it's going to be coming out next month. But I mentioned the pandemic because it's hard to talk about something scary when you're at home, and especially the fact that at this point, I think I prefer a lot of movie monsters and prose ones to the ones going outside, because it's just people, wash your hands and wear a mask. It's not rocket science. And I think there's no horror that can compare to people being stubborn. But I do appreciate that everyone's doing monsters right now, or other horrors. And thank you, Eddie, for being a great editor and being very patient with me on revisions. And I hope you all enjoy the book when it comes out.
I guess
The other thing about sorry to interrupt, reading horror and watching horror, there's a lot more control. If you're reading a book and it's getting too much for you, you close the book and you put it down, and we don't have control of what's going on in the world right now. So I think a lot of people might find the escape into a story where they have the control of being able to say, you know what, I'm going to put this away for a little bit, is very important as well. And I just wanted to throw that out there.
I guess that leaves me. As far as how the writing's gone on my end, it kind of opened an avenue because I saw when places first started closing down and the money started drying up places, big houses were letting new editors go and not buying as many books. So that kind of let me off the hook. It's like, if you don't sell a novel this year, it's not your fault. Like, it's not your failure this year. So that's okay. Just do whatever you're going to do. And as for the writing, I found I'm writing like there's been a cure and it's just working its way in. I recently, about a month ago, a short I wrote has a guy in a Starbucks and he feels a bit guilty that he's not wearing a mask when the barista is wearing a mask. And that's kind of as far as I go into it. I know things have been a bit different in Canada than other places in the world, especially where I live, where I'm very secluded. But as far as taking in horror, horror on screen and in books is usually about conquering monsters of some sort. And more often than not, there is a victory for the good guys in some way, or at least the horror is over. There's some cosmic horror that just, it never ends. It's too big. You can't beat it. That's probably why I don't like it very much. But there's always someone to defeat in the books and in the movies, whereas right now there's nothing to defeat but ignorance, and that's as widespread as it gets. So I guess it's easy to fall into horror and wish for the best when you're watching or reading.
I think that's absolutely right. And another thing I've thought about horror, coming back to what Priya was also saying earlier, was it's meaningful. That's why we all want the ghost to be behind the door or behind the curtain, because it's something meaningful. It's better than nothing at all there. And when you're being faced with an uncaring virus that is completely random and that you have no control over, you kind of want that personal touch of horror, I think. Certainly I do as a reader.
A virus is one thing, but the thing is, we've had viruses all the time. Like chickenpox. You don't get it from chickens. You get it from a very contagious disease, unless you get a vaccine. And I think, going on to what Eddie's saying, horror also has hope in it. In the Twilight Zone would have people that would sometimes deserve their fates, sometimes people that didn't, or people that fought against it. And Strange Horizons, by the way, will not accept stories on either side of the spectrum. Their list says, we don't want stories where people who are jerks, to put it nicely, end up getting what's coming to them, or someone who for no reason is thrown into a horrific situation. And there has to be that middle ground. Maybe someone deserves it, maybe they don't, but horror always has the hope that you can face the fears and either conquer them or to live with them, which is why the best Twilight Zone episodes, A Little Peace and Quiet, Little Girl Lost, they don't feature people who are necessarily jerks, but people in the middle. In the case of Little Peace and Quiet, a librarian that just wants some time to read, but then his glasses fall off in the middle of a nuclear devastation. Or A Little Girl Lost, two parents rescuing their child from a strange dimension and doing all they can to get her home safely. And so I think the hope matters a lot. Otherwise, you just have grim and gritty, which we can all agree has gone a little bit sideways over the past few years. Am I right?
You're on mute.
I am on mute. So one of the things that I noticed this past week was a video that I'm pretty sure has been debunked, but it was ostensibly a dashboard cam. Uh-oh. I just had someone walk in very upset. Let me start over. So this week, if anybody has seen the video that I think it was the New York Post had put up of the ostensible dashboard cam video from Gettysburg, If you watch the video, it looks like there's these old figures walking past the cannon. And I put that up in the Crone Girls Press Facebook group, and I also had a bunch of people sharing it online. And I noticed that every time that happened, people were chiming in with their stories of encounters. And, we're talking about, we're in the middle of all of the things that are going on currently, and we're still yearning for that connection. Looking at, is our ghost real? Well, I've had these experiences. So I kind of wanted to talk about, a couple of you had mentioned horror being this personal thing. What exactly is that personal connection? I think as writers, we're trying to write characters that people will connect with. How do we do that in these various horror tropes and settings?
I think fear is one of the most powerful emotions we have. And I think to some extent, I am always writing about what scares me, even when I'm not writing horror. Like, the Menopausal Superheroes series is not horror. However, it has a lot to say about being treated badly because I'm getting old. It has a lot to say about being treated badly because I'm female, right? And so those are dealing with rough, ugly emotions and turning it into something that feels like art to me. And I think that's the wonder of what horror writers can do, is, turn something so ugly into something that, was it Jude who talked about the feeling of hope? Yeah, I think hope really is such an important element in horror, because my favorite horror stories are not the ones where it starts bad, it goes worse, and then here we are in the cosmic sense of things, and it's nobody got anything out of it. Even when the good guys lose, when the last man standing is taken down by the monster, there was all that fight along the way. There was all that things they tried, and there was all that hope and effort. And I think that's the thing for horror. That's why I find it comforting, even though comfort seems like a very strange word to apply to reading horror.
It's a word that I empathize with.
I will have to say my personal connection with horror is that I always see it as a bit of fun. Probably the equivalent would be a theme park ride, the Jurassic Park one before the reboots. Because technically the ride ends with you going into a dark facility with dilos spitting venom at you. Not real venom, actually. And a bunch of raptors, maybe. And then you see a T-Rex about to lunge at you. And my brother always had a theory that the T-Rex eats you at the end of the ride, that you don't escape. But the thing is, you're perfectly safe, if a bit wet, at the end of the ride. And I feel horror is the same thing. You're reading about a very scary situation, whether it's a lady being stoned to death in the lottery. Spoilers, everyone, for a story that's 100 years old. Or, in the case of Carrie, the devastation that a single bucket of blood can do when it drops at the right time. But the thing is, you're not actually in that movie. You're not the one holding the stone or standing in the middle of the crowd. You're kind of listening. And that's what I feel is what connects me to horror, is that it's not real. It's just a ride, and you can always turn it off. And it's definitely one thing that Eddie had to coax me out of. We had a pretty nice discussion about horror. It's fun, and when it's introspective. And I am one day going to do a blog or essay about it, what it means when you have more popcorn versus more meaning. Because I'm influenced by The Dark and such. Great magazine to read, really hard to get into. That talks more about the intellectual side of horror, stuff that's scary to us. And also what I've noticed that not a lot of POC are in horror, though that is changing. And so I strive to put my experiences as an Indian woman, as an immigrant in there, or rather, first gen. My mom came in to the States and I was born here along with my siblings. And so I talk about that, or about the horrors that we don't often see. And Get Out is a great example of this, the movie, Because in most horror movies, the black guy dies first due to their lack of sensing this is a horror movie. Get Out is not like that. It's basically a story about gaslighting and about how you need to trust your instincts in a dangerous situation. And Rod, who's probably the best character in the movie, is the one who's like, don't go into the dangerous situation, and keeps calling up on his friend Chris. And it's ultimately a deconstruction of, you may not be able to avoid a horrific situation unless you trust your instincts, which is a more real experience now than it was before. Those are my 2 cents anyway.
I think the personal side of it is what the importance of the characters. You have such a unique or outlandish or out of this world situation, whether it be ghosts or monsters, vampires, what have you. But if you have characters that have emotional responses that you can relate to, that's what really draws you in. Clear, like, I would love to say I've seen a ghost or I've been in a haunted house, or, you know, I don't not believe any of that stuff. I just can't say I've ever seen it. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I can say that I know what it's like to be a dad. I know what it's like to be, individual. And if the characters, even if they're not, white male, approaching 50-year-old guy, if they're reacting in an emotionally true way, I can go right with them and be a part of that story and say, yeah, they're seeing ghosts, they're being haunted. Oh my God, what's going to happen? But going back to kind of what Priya said, if it doesn't have that, it is just a ride, and you don't have that attachment, and it doesn't become any kind of personal thing. You're just like, oh yeah, that was kind of cool, but whatever. But if any of the characters hit you here, you can go with the rest of it, no problem. And that's what the best writers of horror do. They don't write, they're not great writers because they write horror like Stephen King and all those guys. They're great writers because they write awesome characters, and they just choose to put those characters in horrific situations. And that's what makes it, I think anyway, a personal experience.
I like the ordinariness of how most horror starts, because the horror stories that I've enjoyed the best are the normal life that you can imagine yourself in, and then the writer takes you by the hand and guides you somewhere that is extremely dark, but that is seamless from where you've started. I think I like that very much, in the same way that when I was a kid, I liked stories where you go through a wardrobe and you end up in a magic land, except now the land is very unpleasant and full of monsters. I think the other thing about horror that really speaks to me is almost key to horror reading and writing. I think it's loss. I think it's either what you're afraid of losing or the bad decisions you make when you've lost something unthinkable. And I think that's what keeps the human heart of horror for me. And it's these responses that you can imagine. You can see someone making a terrible, murderous choice and think, would I do that? Well, I might do that. And I like that. And those are the stories that linger, even after I've closed the book. They're the ones that stay with me.
So there were a number of stories that I realized after I had sent out the acceptances and I was putting the table of contents together, that most of the stories in the anthology do tend to be, or in this particular anthology, do tend to be very mundane, what they called quiet horror. And Charles, I'm blanking on the name right now. I looked it up before because I always forget his last name, but he was basically in the 80s and 90s pioneering, or maybe kind of publicizing and promoting the idea of quiet horror. These mundane situations where we are, it might have been Finley, it might have been Charles Finley. And so there is an anthology series of books called Shadows. And I've been reading my way through them. They're really good. And I think that probably ended up influencing some of the choices that I made, because a lot of these stories do speak to what happens in present day situations. So Laura Price's story, Primary Manifestations, happens in a haunted house. I think it might be our only haunted house story in the anthology. Charles Grant, yes, thank you, Eddie. And it's the sort of house where normally you'd be like, don't go in there, it's totally haunted and everything creepy is going to happen. But it literally is the last option for their family. Everybody's job has been lost. They have no money. They have no place to go. The only place they can go is the super haunted family estate in the swamps of Florida. And to me, that spoke to some of the same themes like in Jude's story, where people are making decisions based on the slightly better of their totally terrible options. Just these sorts of situations. And then Priya's story, so I absolutely love themed runs, even though I mostly don't go very fast. But to me, they're super fun. So the idea, like I said, of doing a run where you have these pretty benign characters, at this point in 2020, like I said, I'm ready to join them in the woods, just dragging me away. I don't care anymore. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, so I realized that this theme was very much coming out in all of the stories that I was accepting and arranging the table of contents. But another thing about it is they were all hitting these horror tropes, these genre tropes. I will fall asleep. But I basically want to talk about horror tropes and talk about the very specific tropes that people are using in their stories, like the haunted house story, or the villagers who make a sacrifice every year type of trope, that sort of thing. I kind of want to talk about, what are our favorite tropes as readers and writers, and if y'all were specifically thinking about tropes before you wrote the story, or maybe during the editing process or something like that.
I definitely was thinking about things like henchmen and servants to dark and evil characters in mind, like Dracula's Renfield and that sort of thing. And around the time that I wrote this, I was also watching Downton Abbey, which will make you think differently about servants, I would think, than other fiction might. And so I was looking at it like how the servants judge the people they're working for. And my cleaning lady does not entirely approve of her employer, who she doesn't like as much as she liked her previous employer. And that kind of snarky, judgy attitude was a lot of fun to play with. Because in a lot of stories, the henchies are so bought into exactly whatever the boss is purporting, that they share the vision, or they're magicked or hypnotized or whatever into just being a part of things with no volition. And so I don't know that I set out to do that, but once I was doing it, I was like, oh, I see what you did there, brain.
I don't think of the trope first, and I don't ever go for a story to read because of the trope. Although I will admit I have a weakness for werewolf stories. But I won't read all the zombie stories that come out because it's a zombie story or a vampire. I like to read stories that the plot of that particular story captures me. And if it happens to be about vampires, or it happens to be about, zombies, that's cool. And in the stories that I write, I found a couple times when I've thought about, oh, maybe I should write a werewolf story, I couldn't come up with anything. I just was like, ah. But other times I think about a situation or an image, kind of like with my novella that's in the anthology, The Bugs Come Out at Night. I had an image that led to a story. And I find that the things that I end up completing, I have tons of stuff that I've started and not finished, like I'm sure most of you are the same. But the ones I've found that I've gotten to the end, whether it was good or bad, but I've actually completed a beginning, middle, and end to a story, have never come from just trying to do a trope. It's kind of like what Samantha was saying, that if there was a trope, it came in later. It kind of snuck its way in without me even thinking about it. But it was more about this plot and the characters that I put them in this situation and then it turned out into a haunted house, or it turned into a what have you. So the trope, as much as I can enjoy tropes that other people have written, but I never go for them first. That's never at the top of the list, for me anyway.
I will have to say the tropes that I liked technically weren't in the story. I did set another story to Compass and Break that was more filled with tropes I liked, but for obvious reasons, owing to about, as Rachel said, about 1,600 submissions, it didn't get in. The trope that the Terrible Teddies had was all part of the show. I read TV tropes every day, and I've gotten into arguments with moderators for deleting my entries. Don't delete my stuff. But I was thinking about the fact about how all part of the show is basically where something horrific happens, but if you're watching a spectacle, you're assuming that it's part of the special effects. And the thing is, what's scary is that it's a real life thing. In an early incarnation of Jaws, a father who fell off, and because the bar on the boat broke, and this wouldn't have been a problem because most of the bay where Jaws was shallow, apart from the part where the mechanical shark rides on a track. And he was in real danger of being crushed. Fortunately, the cast member in charge of the boat was on the ball. He quickly directed the boat, got him back on in time with only a few scrapes and bruises, and everyone applauded because they thought it was just an extra stunt. But I know you're giving the exact same face I did. Defunctland has a great video on it, and I can provide a link to it, about that incident and why Jaws had so many technical difficulties before the reboot. But it was striking me to that, how a lot of horrific things can happen and you don't understand because you're assuming it's part of what you paid for in the entertainment. It even happened at Art Basel. Someone was stabbed and people assumed it was an exhibit. Yeah. Only in Miami or Florida, as they say. And so that's part of what went into the Terrible Teddies, that the lead has to figure out, the bears probably aren't supposed to be tackling the runners that hard for a friendly competition. And that's the main trope that went in. And also guile, hero, and adrenaline. Just someone running and managing to outpace the bears to save their best friend. And that was what informed the story. The other story that I submitted, Sincerely Spider, was more meta, which about voice acting and the horrors of the fact that voice actors' characters may be more realistic or lively than the actual people.
I guess to write a story, I don't ever go in knowing anything. I've gotten to the point where I don't even have to have an idea. I just start writing somebody I know or something I've seen. Usually, like 99% of the time, it's just me. Just a different stage of me going through a story. But I have written novel-length manuscripts based on, I haven't written a vampire novel yet. I did that once. Another time I was like, I haven't written, no, it actually wasn't I haven't written, it was, let's see if I can write the second best werewolf story. Because obviously nobody's topping Stephen Graham Jones' Mongrels. So I did that. I don't know. I don't look for tropes when I'm as a reader. I read very, very widely. So I go through stints of reading, 10 or 15 horror stories in a row, and then 30 or 40 general fiction stories in a row, or crime stories, or anything like that, because that all that stuff helps with writing horror. If you just read horror, eventually all your characters will look pretty much the same as everybody else's characters when they're writing. So I do like to mix it up. And before I forget, Priya had mentioned Little Girl Lost from Twilight Zone. That's a Richard Matheson story, as many of the Twilight Zone episodes were, and it's fantastic. If anybody was listening and like, I wonder, whatever. But Richard Matheson, very good.
Jude?
Well, I'm the same in that I don't consciously think of tropes when I set out to write, but when I look at stuff that I've written, there's a real preponderance of desperate person who wants something, makes a questionable decision, and then has to cope with the consequences. And person fights monster and at the end discovers that the darkness was in them all along. I seem to come back to that quite a lot.
And I promise that this question is not based on the fact that we'll be opening up for submissions again next year. But here we go. We have a crystal ball right now. And in that crystal ball, we are going to use our crystal ball to write a story that's going to be set in the mundane world 2 years from now. So as horror writers, what are we including in this story? What do we think that either characters or setting or plot, what is that going to look like writing 2 years into the future?
I could see a lot of things with an isolation theme, because so many people right now are feeling so isolated. They don't have all their usual things to go, places to be, people to be with. And so, it's pretty easy for an imaginative person to have their brain go down some really dark alleys when they spend a lot of time alone. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if we see a lot of stuff that, whether directly or indirectly about the pandemic, plays on isolation and what that does to a person emotionally and mentally.
That's a tough one. I agree with what Samantha says. That'll certainly be a lot of that. I wonder too if there'll be a lot of the opposite, a lot of stuff stories that happen out in the world among people in malls and movie theaters and restaurants and all these places where we haven't been able to go, and people are going to be excited to be back in those places, so they're going to write about being back to those places. And then maybe from the horror point of view, what do they run into? What has been in those places while they've been empty all this time? What kind of creatures from netherworlds or have been occupying those spaces, and now they're mad that we're back. Maybe that's a cool idea. I don't know. And now I'm just spitballing stuff, but it's definitely going to be interesting to see the landscape of fiction and horror fiction in the immediate future once this pandemic has, if not been ended, been controlled somewhat, and the changing world that we're going to be looking at.
I hope, and it may not happen, but I hope that we start to see a real focus on climate-themed horror, because I think one thing the pandemic has done, as well as drawing attention to itself, I think it also has focused people's mind on climate change, and I am hopeful that there is increasing acceptance of the need for radical action to stop irretrievable harm being done to the planet, or more irretrievable harm. And I really would like to see more fiction exploring that, because the fiction I have read, it's so dark, and yet it also does have the glimmer of hope at the end of it. And I don't know if it will happen, but it's certainly something that I'd like to see.
Priya?
I think Strange Horizons is probably going to update their cliche list in about 2 years. Probably they're going to say, I bet you they're going to say no more stories about viruses or diseases becoming giant monsters. I bet you they're going to say that, because it's definitely going to inspire a lot of what it's like to face something that you can't see. I do love the cliched list a lot. Creepypasta also has one, though they don't pay. I mean, for those who don't know, creepypasta is a form of online story that's usually portrayed as a fictional thing being real and such. But creepypasta has banned video games, especially Pokemon stuff, video game cliches with plushies, and Jeff the Killer. There's a whole list, and I actually got inspired by a story about that, because I like, come on, plushies are great. How can you can surely make a good story with video games and plushies, just don't use a real game. And in any case, probably in 2 years, a lot of people will be doing stories about what it's like to be isolated versus people who have chronic pain and said they've been dealing with being at home their whole life. And so it might be an interesting exploration to see what we do, because sometimes I think being by ourselves or being unable to do our usual routine is much scarier than anything else. And probably, I don't know, I've got a horror story based on a job interview, Winnie, about being at a circle of hell, being a call center, just waiting for hours for an interview with a very bad cop movie playing loudly, and you're just waiting to be called in, but you aren't. I ran out of that call center as soon as the interview was done. Not just because of that, but also because they said we'd be starting on the graveyard shift for phone calls.
I was thinking as you're speaking, it kind of reminds me, the isolation idea. I think maybe people will pull stories away from it as much as they already do. If you think about cell phones, what's one thing that you have to do in a horror story is you have to limit the communication so you can't call for help. And if you're kind of putting everybody aside from it, so maybe there's going to be more stories that take place in the woods, where they don't mention the pandemic in a real sense, but there's stories in the woods. It would be nice if they just fully were stories about, realistically stories about, people in masks, doing things, as opposed to making everything underlying. I don't have a problem with facing it head on as a story when it's not the story, because in all reality, the pandemic isn't the story. It's surviving in a pandemic that is the story, or after a pandemic. 2 years, who knows if there's going to be any vaccine or anything like that by then. So I don't know. I don't think people have changed that much because they still read most of the same books. They're still ingesting the same TV. But I don't know. I guess it would be nice to, as Jude said, to have some more ecological kind of horror fiction, but maybe not. I don't know. I have no idea if anybody's going to do anything, because it's, as far as I can tell now, I'm more surprised that there's so many insane people everywhere, everywhere, that you just can't think of somebody else first. It blows my mind. So I have no idea what people are going to write, because it turns out everybody's crazy.
That's hilarious. That's the funniest thing I've heard, but it's so true. That's the most frightening thing, is that we all realize how many crazy people there are out there in the world. That's frightening.
Social media
So
is
is
the
how many
greatest
people
nightmare.
think that we're the crazy people.
No, we're just the crazy people that admit it. We know it. We recognize it. We embrace it. We celebrate it. To hell with everybody else. Well,
It
guys,
could be a fun anthology idea called.
yeah, that could. Yeah, I feel sure there's going to be plenty. In fact, yeah, the first anthology I saw come out was within 6 weeks of the start of the pandemic. Really, we had a conversation. We saw the first one come out within 6 weeks, but that was neither here nor there.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I have seen this conversation happen in a number of channels, groups, even Messenger, how do we as publishers and writers acknowledge and incorporate it? And I don't think there's a right answer to that question. Obviously, I'm continuing to publish horror, but, we'll see.
Well, guys, thanks a lot for coming on and joining us here. Had a lot of fun. Hope you guys did as well. So let's kind of go in reverse order. If you can tell everybody where they can find you. Eddie, we'll go first with you.
My personal site is jiffypopandhorror.com. I'm on Twitter at GenerousEd. I have 2 podcasts. One is a focus on Canadian suspense writing, and that's booksnorthpodcast.com. And I have the Unnerving podcast, which is horror, and that's all found at unnervingbooks.com. And then I think my Twitter for Unnerving is Unnerving Books. I could be wrong, but that is where you find me.
Mike.
I don't have a big online presence for writing yet. I do have a website. My day job is a documentary video editor. So that website is sullivanedit.com, and I do have a tab on there for writing, but it's mostly my video editing stuff, and you can email me through that at mike@sullivanedit.com.
Priya?
So I have a personal website at www.priyajschreither.com. I also currently have a media account where I'm running a public with some friends called Permanent Nerd Network, or PN, where we talk about nerd stuff. And I can recommend my friend Brandon for his talks on Final Fantasy and other things. I'm also currently writing reality news articles for Screen Rant, if anyone ever wants to visit. So those are the places where you can find me.
Samantha.
Hello. So I'm Samantha Bryant, and that's usually enough to know to find me. If you Google Samantha Bryant, make sure you add the word author, because otherwise you'll get the actress who's married to Colin Hanks. And I can rock a ball gown, but not like she can. And my website is predictably then samanthabryant.com. I play around mostly on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook so far as social media. And if I'm not Samantha Bryant on those, then I'm Samantha B. Writer, just the letter B in the middle for Bryant. You can find my stuff also on Falstaff Books, the Menopausal Superhero series. I'm working on the 4th novel right now, and I just had a collection of short stories released. Feels like yesterday, but I think it's been a month.
Both can be true this year. Jude.
I maintain a relatively low profile on social media, but you can find me on Twitter at Squinty Witch. And you can find my podcast audio drama work on a show that a friend and I write called Tales from the Alethean Society, about a bunch of bickering and incompetent Victorian occultists in Glasgow. And that's at www.hunterhoose.co.uk, and you have to spell Hoose with 2 O's.
Rachel.
So we are online at www.cronegirlspress.com, and that will lead you to our Twitter account, which is at Crone Girls Press. We also have a group on Facebook, and I believe it's facebook.com/cronegirls. And that's usually that's where we're most active. All my personal stuff right now is kind of low key because I'm focusing on making sure people know about the anthology, which will also be out October 1st. We also, when we're open for submissions, will be on Duotrope and Horror Tree. I think we ended up on Submission Grinder and a couple of other places. And we should be open in the spring, but please don't hold me to that because things are changing. But again, this is volume 2 and there's going to be a volume 3. So if people enjoy Raylan, so if people enjoy writing horror, I hope to keep bringing horror to people who enjoy it. And even some people who don't, I'm going to just make them watch it. Be like, here you go, read this book.
And I've been your host today. I'm Jim Nettles. You can find me at jamespnettles.com. That'll link you to the fiction me, the nonfiction me. You can find us at authoressentials.net, authoressentialsworkshops.com, and of course, ConTinual here at the ConTinual Convention. Thanks everybody for joining us, and we will see you next time.